On the night of May 24th, 2000, just before 11 p.m., a quiet Wendy's in Flushing, Queens, became the scene of one of New York City's most shocking fast food massacres. 9 months earlier, John Taylor had been fired from that very location, but that night he came back, and he did not come alone. Last year, I covered a shooting that occurred in the Manhattan area. It was a mass shooting, and I mentioned that shooting in particular had been one of the few that have occurred in NYC. Of course, there have been so many murders, so much crime in NYC for so many years, but hardly is there a mass shooting like these ones. I said last one was the one at the Wendy's in Queens, and I promised that I'd cover that in the future. And today, here we are. I also want to mention a happy Pride Month to all. John Taylor arrived with Craig Godineaux, whom he had met in the Bronx. Together, they walked into the restaurant and went straight into the office of this restaurant, where the manager who fired Taylor, Jean Augustia, was working. At gunpoint, Taylor forced Augustia to call for an emergency meeting. 7 employees gathered, unaware of what was happening. Taylor and Godineaux marched all 7 workers into the restaurant's freezer. Inside, they forced plastic bags over their heads, gagged them, and one by one shot each victim. When the gunfire stopped, 7 people had been shot. At this point, only 3 were still alive. 4 died at the scene. After the 2 shooters fled, one of the wounded survivors, 23-year-old Patrick Castro, managed to call the police. When the officers arrived, they discovered that $2,400 had been taken from the restaurant's safe. The NYC Chief Medical Examiner's office identified the 4 who died at the scene: 44-year-old Ramon Nazario, 40-year-old Ali Ibadat, 23-year-old Anita Smith, and 18-year-old Jeremy Mealy. This Manhattan office released the names and the ages of them. 3 others were rushed to Queens Medical. Doctors fought to save them, but they lost 27-year-old Jean Dumel Augusti. He did not survive his injuries. This was the manager that had fired Taylor. The 2 survivors remaining did indeed survive after undergoing surgery. Patrick Castro, the one who called the cops, and 18-year-old Jaquan Johnson, they lived to tell what happened inside that freezer. Within 48 hours, the NYPD launched an intense manhunt. On May 26, about 2 days after the shooting, the NYPD acted on a tip coming out of Long Island. They searched the Bayshore area. There, they spotted John Taylor's family dealing with a bike accident just outside their home. When John Taylor himself stepped out, the officers quickly moved in and arrested him. At the Queens Detective Squad, investigators found a fanny pack that he had been carrying. Inside was one of the pistols, believed to be the weapon used inside the shooting. It was the only gun ever recovered. Soon after, moments later, another tip led police to another part of NYC, Jamaica, Queens. Inside, a store called SCR was searched, and that's where the officers found one of the workers who was involved in the shooting, Craig Godineaux. He too was arrested and taken to the Queens Detective Squad building as well. Both suspects were lodged into the Rikers Island jail. The following day, they were brought before Queen's Criminal Court. Prosecutor Craig Godineaux charged them with severe felonies, first-degree robbery, 5 counts of first-degree murder, and 2 weapons offenses. Judge Michael Eloise ordered that both remain at the Rikers Island jail without bond to await trial. This judge also directed a grand jury to review the evidence to confirm the charges. Both suspects pleaded not guilty in advance. About a week later, the grand jury returned an indictment confirming the charges. And about a month after the attack, the 2 surviving victims were discharged from Queen's Medical. As proceedings moved forward, defense strategies began to emerge. Kevin Doyle, a public defender representing Taylor, argued that his client was driven by anger after being fired. Meanwhile, Craig's public defender, Stephen Zissou, claimed that he had intellectual disabilities and described him as mentally retarded. He also claimed that Craig had been influenced very easily by John Taylor, but the legal outcomes would diverge. On January 22, 2001, under a negotiated plea deal, Craig pleaded guilty to murder and robbery in order to avoid the death penalty. In exchange, the weapons offenses, which were the ones remaining, were dropped. About a month later, on the 21st, Judge Stephen Fisher refused to let him withdraw the 6 guilty pleas. And the day after that, on the 22nd, this judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive terms of life in prison without parole for the murders and vacated the remaining robbery offense. On the other hand, John Taylor went to trial. Jury selection started on September 10, 2002, and by October 16 that year, a jury of 12 members and 4 alternates was seated. Opening statements followed about 2 days after that. Throughout the trial, defense motions attempted to dismiss the charges or restart proceedings, but Fisher denied each request. The judge allowed the jury to deliberate and render a verdict. On November 19th, that same year, 2002, that jury found John Taylor guilty on all counts. Then a week later, the jury voted to sentence Taylor to death. Judge Fisher immediately upheld the decision, refusing to restart that phase of the trial nor toss the death penalty option, and sentenced John Taylor to 5 consecutive death sentences while the remaining convictions remained vacated. But the story does not end there. Craig, as Judge Fisher would not resentence him, appealed to the higher courts, and the New York Appeals Court in Albany upheld both his plea and life sentences. Taylor also appealed to the higher courts, and on October 23rd, 2007, that Albany Appeals Court did uphold his convictions. But he did have somewhat success. The death penalty was overturned. And just over a month later, on November 29, 2007, Judge Fisher resentenced him to 5 consecutive terms of life in prison without parole. Today, both remain behind bars. Taylor was once on death row at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, but after his death penalty was overturned, he was transferred to the Wendy in Alden. Craig, on the other hand, was initially held in Auburn for evaluation before being moved to the Shawangunk in Wallkill, where he is still incarcerated. A crime that began with a grudge ended in an irreversible loss. forever marking one of the deadliest robberies in New York City history. Thank you for listening. Take care and have a good rest of your day. Stay safe and happy Pride Month once again.